for the second day of our Trade and Uneven Development Conference, which kicks off with an exciting session on sectoral shocks. So we have two papers, one on the impact of commodity booms, the other on the impact of appliances and on female labor force participation in particular, and two excellent discussions. So without further ado, Felipe, Benguria, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. So it's 3:30 in Johannesburg, 6:45 in Sydney somehow, so it's time to start, right? I will start by thanking the organizers. I'm aware it's a ton of work, but hopefully I think it was worth it because it's been a really great conference, and it's great that it's so aligned with the mission of the World Bank as well. So we've been having a lot of fun and learning a lot here. So I'm going to talk about our paper on spatial linkages and the uneven effects of a commodity boom. This is joint work with Felipe #2, who is in France right now, and Shihangyin Zhang, who is here with us today. So the question that we have is super straightforward. It's a well-established fact that commodity cycles have big macroeconomic effects. But what we want to ask today is how do commodity cycles, how does a commodity boom impact workers depending on where they live, the sector they work on, and their skill type. In addition, we have a second related question. It is how do spatial linkages, so namely interregional trade and interregional migration, shape the overall and impact of the boom and its heterogeneous effect on the different types of people. So I'll tell you right away what we do in this paper. We have a multi-region, many-region, small open economy model, which allows for these linkages, trade and migration within across the regions. This is a dynamic model. It's sector, then a sector we're going to call tradable right? We're going to calibrate them all to micro and macro data for Brazil, and we're going to analyze the response of the economy to that increase in commodity prices. And for that, we're going to use the fact that the boom was different across regions depending on the different, commodity basket that the different regions in Brazil have. We know that the main commodities in Brazil, for example, are coffee, soybeans, and sugarcane, and there's several others, and the different regions have different initial specialization. That the commodity boom accounts at the national level for a 4.7% decline in the skill premium. This is 1/4 of the observed 18% decline in the skill premium during this period. So that sort of that connects to an important policy discussion in Brazil, because Brazil saw a big decline in inequality during the 2000s, at the same time than the commodity boom. And a discussion in Brazil at that point was, well, if all this decline in inequality is driven by the boom, the problem is that it's reversible. Commodity prices go up and down. If it's due to more persistent factors, that's another story. So I'll go back to this theme later on, but our model allows us to say to what extent was the decline in inequality due to the boom. We also see substantial heterogeneity across states and sectors. So if we bunch together all the state-sector combinations, the average one, if we focus on unskilled workers, for example, the average one had a real wage increase of about 9%, but this ranges from 2% to 34%, moving between the 10th and 90th percentile. So that really speaks to the issue of uneven, gains from the boom and trade and uneven development. In terms of employment, the effects are, I would say, moderate. Half the states gain employment, half the states contract. But one thing to keep in mind is that moderate changes in employment doesn't mean that migration is not relevant. And what we're going to do is use our model to do counterfactuals and shut down, for example, interregional migration or shut down interregional trade. And so allowing for migration can allow for adjustments along the price margin or the quantity margin in wages or employment flows. And so we give the message that you really need to, do counterfactuals and not just look at the changes in employment and say, oh, they're not so big, So shutting down spatial linkages does change the message. The decline in the national skill premium, the aggregate skill premium, is 11% larger in that case. And I would say more importantly, it only falls without spatial linkages in about half the states, whereas it falls in almost all the states otherwise. The two first facts there are consistent because without spatial linkages, it falls more, though, in the bigger states that contribute more to the aggregate skill premium. And the gains from the boom across state widen. Okay, so spatial linkages matter for this story of mostly focused on its macroeconomic impacts. We have a recent paper listed there in which we go more micro. We focus on Brazil. From the commodity boom, thinking out inequality based on where people live, so allowing for many regions, thinking out inequality in terms of skilled and unskilled workers. And in addition to that, using this many region model, we analyze the role of the spatial linkages, interregional trade and interregional migration. So that's the contribution there. I think our paper is also related to papers that, from many angles, assess the role of spatial linkages in the adjustment to external shocks, either NAFTA or the China shock on the U.S. and several other contributions. These are some of them. There's more, right? It's more broadly related to of the spatial linkages. So I'll jump straight into telling you about the data that we use, and then some empirical patterns that motivate the modeling choices. So before I talk about the model, I want you to understand why some features of the model were necessary. So why does the model have this heterogeneity and so on? So we have time series on 14 commodities, including the main commodities from Brazil. This includes agricultural and mining commodities. To give you a sense of things, coffee, sugarcane, and soybeans command, the largest, share of exports and employment. Cattle is also very important nowadays. So Brazil is pretty diversified in terms of commodities, and the different regions differ a lot, of course. Some specialize more in coffee, some specialize more in sugarcane, you know. So in terms of like local labor market outcomes, we're going to use HICE. I finally learned how to pronounce HICE. So this is a linked employer-employee census of the formal sector. We're going to work at the annual frequency, and our data covers the whole boom of the 2000s. We have data from 1999 to 2013 that we're using here. And we're going to use the state as the regional unit of analysis. There's 27 states in Brazil. Why the state? The reason why we're going to use the state as the regional unit is because that's the level at which we have interregional trade flows. When it comes to measuring labor market outcomes, like employment, wages, there's more disaggregate data. But data on interregional trade flows is rather rare. Brazil does collect that. We have that for the baseline year, and it's available at the state level. I'm going to show you a map of Brazil soon. So we're going to compute outcomes in 3 sectors, as I said before: commodities, then tradables or manufacturing, and non-tradables or services. And we have this data on interregional trade flows, and we're also going to use data on flows, so migration flows between region sectors combinations. We're going to later see how, you know, the model allows for these movements. So we have the counterpart in the data because the data has this longitudinal dimension that allows us to track workers over time. I almost skipped that. So as I was saying earlier, the impact of the boom is the exposure to boom differs. You know, if let's say that, you know, iron prices went up more than sugarcane prices and you produce a lot of iron, then you're more exposed. So we have the time series of commodity prices, and we're going to create employment weighted averages that define a regional commodity price index. You're going to see later what we do with the model, but we're going to feed this regional commodity price index to the model. So in the model, we're going to have, we're going to use this price index, right? So here, it's a weighted average with weights coming from the demographic census, which is the broader measure of employment, but it has the limitation that it's only available every 10 years. So it doesn't help us with this model that is dynamic, but it does help us to calculate the regional commodity price index. So this figure gives you a sense of the magnitude of the boom. So throughout all the results that come later, we're going to calculate changes between 2002 and 2011, which we have identified as being the trough and the peak of the boom. And so the percent change in this commodity price index across most states, as you can see, goes between 50% and 100%. You know, it had a big macroeconomic impact in Brazil. It was a big deal, so big numbers. And we're going to try to see now, you know, the different effects on different types of people. So this is repetitive in a way, but it's important that to me that you can see the map of Brazil, especially if you've never thought out Brazil before. So here you can see that the intensity of this change in the regional commodity price index that hits the darker shades is more increase, and you know it hits you know very strongly in the southeast. Minas Gerais there is the darkest one, and so on, right? So I'm going to briefly show you some patterns of heterogeneity. We find in the data, of course, that there's variation, there's heterogeneity in terms of the distribution of employment across sectors. That's the figure in the left. And you can see, for example, that Mato Grosso do Sul, which is somewhere in the middle there of the map, has 25% employment in commodities, whereas in Sao Paulo and the capital, the Distrito Federal, it's much lower. In addition to that, skill intensity over in each regional economy also varies across space, as you can imagine. And the wealthier parts of Brazil and the bigger cities that we're more familiar with, the states with those cities like Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, within each sector, so it goes, for example, in the commodity sector from 13% to 1% in different states. You had a question?
How do you want us to think about agriculture? Is the entirety of agriculture part of the commodity sector?
Yes. Our view.
And is it captured in the rice data as well?
Yeah, so our view of the commodity sector is that it's everything in agriculture plus mining. So the agriculture is a sector that is has a higher level of informality to some extent than, let's say, mining, which is much more formal, and than some manufacturing and service industries. In our previous work, we have looked, so the demographic census is what captures everything, and it's done after 10 years. I mean, every 10 years, so it doesn't help us with the dynamics. So in our previous work, we have done comparisons of, how much of agriculture are we measuring. So, I mean, informality in Brazil is pretty large. It really depends on what you measure it, on how you measure it. So some people think, I don't know, 35%. Some people say more. Really depends on how you measure it. And it's a little bit uneven across states. So right now, I don't have results to show you on the coverage. We've looked at it in our previous paper, but yeah, that's definitely something that to keep in mind. And it's good to talk about that. In terms of the skill premium, this is the decline in the skill premium during this period, which I was telling you was pretty important. 18% decline during the 2000s, and this fell in every state essentially, but there was large variation, going between like 36% and 10% in different states, right? And so our question is going to be how much of that was driven by the commodity boom, right? So in addition to that, and this is the last feature of the data that I want to inform you about, there's heterogeneity in how connected the different regions are with the rest of Brazil. So Brazil is not a dot, it's very large, and as you know, there are some regions back there in the Amazonas and some regions more to the coast. And so we compute here on the left the average migration gross flows, and the point here is that it varies substantially across states. It's higher in smaller states typically. And on the right, we have the share of movers across sectors and states. So in the average year, 10% of people move either across sectors, across states, or both. And then you have the breakdown. There's somewhat of an increase over time in that. And there's also differences across state in how they're connected to the rest of the states in terms of interregional trade, right? And this graph shows the total interstate exports over state GDP varies between 96% to 4% in both extremes, right? So it varies a lot as well. So all that heterogeneity is gonna go into the mall, and that's why I wanted to show you those facts. I'm gonna go into the mall section now. I'm gonna give you a sketch of the mall. I want you to have in your head the mechanisms, right? The intuition behind how the model works. I'm not gonna have time for a bunch of equations, but I'm gonna show you the key things. So in our previous work, we studied cross-sector transmission, essentially. We went back, this is a previous work, so I'm not gonna tell you very much about it, but this is also working here, so it's important to understand it. So we went back to the Dutch disease economics of Corden and Neary. So basically, there's a lot of, at that point, there was a lot of cross-country, empirical work that tells us that commodity cycles have a big macroeconomic impact. But what we tried to do in the previous paper is pin down, show evidence, as well as quantify the classical Dutch disease transmission channel. So when commodity prices go up, when there's a boom, on one hand, wages increase and there's more money, there's more wealth, so there's more spending. And so that increases the local demand. Everyone's selling locally benefits. On the other hand, because wages are going up again, that raises the cost of production for everybody. And these effects are heterogeneous. So first of all, the commodity sector is the most unskilled intensive. So when wages go up, it's primarily the unskilled wage that's going up. So the skill premium falls. And how does this affect the manufacturing and the services sector? Well, manufacturing is more unskilled relative to services. So they're hurt more because of the cost channel. And in addition, the service sector sells more locally by definition of non-tradables, so they benefit more from the wealth channel. So there's this heterogeneous transmission towards the other sectors of the economy, okay? But that is cross-sectoral transmission. And here we want to add the dimension of cross-regional transmission, having a many-region model. So what are the important mechanisms? When there's an increase in the local demand, right, from the commodity boom, that's going to increase imports of tradable goods from other regions. In addition, the increase in the local wage is going to make our economy, let's say, less competitive, so it's going to reduce our tradable exports to our regions. And the increase in the local wage is going to attract workers from other regions, right? So that's sort of the key mechanisms that we should have in our head. I'm gonna kind of sketch them all. So this is a small open economy with heterogeneous, meaning skilled and unskilled workers. It's going to have a model with interregional trade and labor market dynamics modeled following the work of Caliendo, Vorkin, and Paro. So it's that type of model. The dynamics follow that, and I'm going to show you the equation that governs migration in a second. So we have, again, the three sectors: commodities, C; tradables or manufacturing, T; non-tradables, N. And all the sectors use a combination of skilled and unskilled labor and intermediate inputs in the production process. So we can combine skilled and unskilled labor and call it effective labor, and the intensities are going to vary across regions as well as across sectors. So all that patterns of heterogeneity that we saw earlier are incorporated in the model, right? The commodity sector is going to face exogenous commodity prices from the world, and it's also going to use a natural resource as an additional input. Yes, the whole consumption basket is going to go into the production function as an intermediate input. So we have end regions with trade between them and migration between them. So the first part of the slide here shows that we're going to have an Armington trade structure, and here we have the expenditure share and tradables of one region, of the product of one region in another region. And so what we have is that each region produces a different commodity good that is then consumed in every region. And in addition, each region produces a tradable good that is also region-specific and then traded with all the other regions. Regarding migration, workers are forward-looking, so they decide the next period location, looking forward, looking forward to all the periods forward. So they have a migration cost that is depending on their skill. It's heterogeneous. And, this follows the standard Caliendo, Dworkin, and Paro framework. So let me go on to the results. I have time. I have like 15-ish. 10 minutes. Okay, great. So we solved them all using dynamic Hadd algebra. There was some discussion of that in a paper yesterday. And the impact of the commodity boom, so all the numbers I'm going to show you are calculated as the difference between an economy that faces the increase in the commodity prices that we saw earlier and an economy that, where the commodity prices remain constant at the initial level. Okay, so everything is calculated as a difference between those two things.
Sorry, can I ask
Yeah.
you something? So at the beginning you said there was this kind of concern in Brazil about the fact these shocks may be reversible. I'm just thinking, how do you think about it in the context of the price change? Like, do agents think this price is going to be permanent, or how do they think about the change in price and whether it matters for that?
Yeah. So they see the whole trajectory of prices that we feed. So they have full information, but up to that point. So, but that's a good question because we can think, and maybe that's a path for future work. How much do people know? What information do they manage, and so on. Due to the commodity boom, so it's results from an increase in both the unskilled wage and the skilled wage, but a stronger increase in the unskilled wage, and it's a 4.7% decline in the skill premium over 2002 to 2011, which is trough and peak of the boom, and that is a quarter of the observed decline in the skill premium in Brazil. So including general equilibrium effects and everything, our model assigns a quarter of the observed decline in the skill premium, the measure of inequality, to the commodities. Here we have, yeah.
What are you doing with the supply of skill?
A little louder.
Sorry?
A little louder.
What are you doing with the supply of skill and unskilled labor during this period?
It's following the data. So yeah, so there are changes and it follows the data. So was there no? Okay. So
clarificate question. So in the data you see the flow of people by their skills?
yes,
Oh,
we can track anybody.
okay.
Yeah. So the graph in the left shows the changes in the sectoral employment shares. So we see a big increase, 8 percentage points in the commodity sector, drawing away from non-tradables and to a larger extent from the tradable sector, in line with this heterogeneous transmission that I was explaining. The cost channel hurts the tradable sector more than the non-tradable sector because the tradable sector is more unskilled intensive, more similar to commodities. The graph on the other side has the reallocation across macro regions. That's an administrative division of Brazil. Brazil is divided into 5 macro regions. Later we're going to zoom into the states, but this is just to give you an idea. So those effects are rather small. We see from a 0.5 percentage point increase in the central west to a 0.5% decline in the southeast. So relatively small movements, but these macro regions are bigger than many countries. Hold on. There. There's also, very uneven gains from the boom. So here we compute the increase in the real wage for unskilled workers and for skilled workers. We lump all like state sector combinations together, and we see that on average, the real wage of unskilled workers increases by 9 percentage points, but this ranges substantially between 2% and 34% at the 10th and 90th percentiles. That's a similar pattern that we see for skilled workers, right? For both skilled and unskilled, see a lot of differences. This is the pattern of the change in the skill premium across states. So in 26 out of the 27 states, the model shows us that the commodity boom led to a decline in the skill premium. The state that behaves in the other direction is a small state. But there's, again, substantial differences in magnitude between, some are like 2%, some are beyond 4%, up to 6% due to the boom. Now, in terms of employment at the state level, we see that 14 states gain employment, unskilled employment. The largest changes, which is kind of intuitive, are among smaller states. So we see the largest changes here in one direction, Roraima, the other one, Alagoas, sorry for the pronunciation. And in most states, skilled and unskilled employment move in the same direction, but not all. So 21 out of 27. Now, we're going to switch gears, and we're going to talk about the role of spatial linkages. And here what I want you to keep in mind is that we do counterfactuals, shutting down in the mall interregional trade or interregional migration. This is different than just looking at the employment changes and saying, oh, they're very big, they're not so big, so migration is very important, not very important. So sometimes people, including me, estimate sort of reduced form regressions and see that with any shock, the China shock, NAFTA, a financial crisis, the reduced form estimates of a change in the total population of a region are not so large, and they conclude that migration is not very important in the adjustment. However, we think that we get at this from a different angle, because migration can lead to price or quantity adjustments. So by shutting down migration in the mall, we can capture, I think, complement the more reduced form part of the literature to find the role of migration. So if we shut down both types of spatial linkages, we see a larger decline in the skill premium at an aggregate level, right, from 4.7% to 5.2%, driven by a lower real wage growth of both unskilled and skilled workers, but primarily unskilled workers. And this is the comparison between the situation in the baseline economy and the economy without spatial linkages in each state. So in the baseline economy, as I had shown you earlier, the skill premium was falling in 26 states, but here, without spatial linkages, it falls only in half of the states. This is not inconsistent with the aggregate number, because here it falls substantially more in some very big states, especially Minas Gerais, which has a very big share of plays a very big role in the aggregate. In addition to that, we find that the gains of the boom are more uneven when we shut down spatial linkages. So here what we did was compute the increase in the real wage of unskilled workers between regions at the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile of changes in the real wage. And we see that the 75th to 25th percentile gap widens when we move from the baseline economy to the economy with no spatial linkages. So it widens from a 7% gap to an essentially 9% gap. So again, the message, I'm going to emphasize it because I think it's important, that you shut down spatial linkages and the effects of the boom become more uneven, right? So to conclude, our goal in the paper was to understand how trade hits differently workers based on where they live, what sector they're in, and their skill type, right? At the national level, we can give a number for what fraction of this big decline in the skill premium in Brazil, this big decline in inequality in Brazil, was due to the boom. We think a quarter of it was due to commodities. And then with counterfactual simulations of them all, we can find that the decline in the skill premium would have been larger without spatial linkages. We think they play a relevant role. And the gains from the boom would have been more uneven, again, without these spatial linkages. So that's the paper. I finished on time. Yeah, I finished better than on time. And thanks so much.
Thank you, Felipe. Very well done. As a discussant, we have Juanma Castro, who will be joining us online.
Can you hear me and see my screen?
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you.
We see you. We don't see your screen. Now we see your screen. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Fantastic. No, thank you for giving me the possibility to discuss this paper and allowing me to present virtually. I unfortunately couldn't, make it to DC. Let me start by saying that this is a very interesting paper. As Felipe discussed, the paper is, answering a very important and precise question. Basically, the paper is measuring the impact of global increases in commodity prices, inequality across worker types and regions in Brazil, and of course exploring how spatial linkages are shaping the responses in wages and unemployment. In a nutshell, what's the mechanism? Essentially, commodity prices are increasing globally because of the basket of commodities these different regions are producing. They're going to be heterogeneously exposed to this increase in commodity prices. In the regions that are relatively more exposed, there is an expansion of labor demand, especially for unskilled workers, because commodities are sectors that are more unskill intensive. This increases wages, right? Which end up incentivizing migration to booming regions, increasing labor supply. And as aggregate demand increases in these regions, as income and population expand, the local price index is going to increase due to the fact that there are non-tradables, right? That are going to be more demanded. And in the end, the commodity shock is going to affect the distribution of economic activity across the different geographies of Brazil and across different industries. And the shocks are going to be unevenly distributed across factors and regions. And there is where they make this point that these spatial linkages, both through trade and migration, are going to spread the gains from the commodity shocks to less exposed regions. And the intuition is simple. On the one hand, when some region is shocked through migration and through this expansion in labor supply, places that are less exposed, or people who were originally in places that are less exposed can benefit by going to the booming region. And on the other hand, through trade, demand for the tradable goods of other regions, on the one hand, expands as well, right? Because of this wealth channel. And on the other hand, there is also less pressure on the local price indices. So, once we have this mechanism in mind, it's interesting to think about what are the key parameters in the model. So on the one hand, the model has many parameters, and of course the responses are a combination of all the parameters of the model and determined in general equilibrium. But I would like to argue that there are three parameters of the model and a vector of parameters that are relevant. First is what mediates the expansion on labor demand from commodities, which is going to be the labor share of commodities. Second is this idea that the commodity sector is unskilled intensive. So, the skill intensity in production in commodities is a key parameter. Then, basically, what governs the labor supply elasticity or the migration elasticity in each region, which we know is going to be a parameter of this fresh air distribution. And here I want to make a small footnote. In this in the current quantification, the authors are assuming that the mobility across regions and across sectors is the same, and I think it would be interesting to allow for differential elasticities across sectors and regions. Presumably, if you could have a nested Gumbel or something like that, it would be cool. And across different types of labor, allowing for different elasticities across unskilled and skilled workers. And then the final parameter that I think it's important for welfare is essentially the elasticity of substitution between tradables and non-tradables in consumption. And since in the end, we are doing a measurement, we are doing a quantification. This is a quantitative model. These elasticities are key for the quantitative implications of the paper, and I would suggest a sketch of calibration that I think would be interesting. So with all their data and using this heterogeneous exposure to commodities, which is arguably exogenous, the authors can compute the impact of this commodity price exposure on a number of statistics at the state level or the microregion level or the municipality level, which include population, skill intensity, the skill premium, non-tradable employment, and employment in the commodity sector. And they can compute this vector, let's say, of elasticities or this vector of regression coefficients and in the data and store them. And then they can solve the model using this dynamic hat algebra with different parameters and run the same regressions on the model-generated data. This is an approach that is used, for instance, in Rodriguez, Clare, Ulate, and Vasquez. Then they just choose the values of these elasticities that match, these empirical regression coefficients. It would be a nice validation of the model, the fact that it can reproduce kind of the reduced form coefficients that we can see on the data. Now I want to make another point, which is mostly as a consumer of knowledge. This paper, as Felipe discussed, mostly focused on the boom, right? And as he alluded in his presentation, in Brazil there was this concern that when the commodity prices went back to normal, reverted, in the bust phase of the super cycle, these gains in reducing the skill premium could be unwinded, right? And this is basically a figure of the global commodity price index of the IMF. As we can see in the second part, of the 210th decade, commodity prices started going down, right? Which of course coincides with a period of a lot of political turmoil in Brazil. And then, there is this empirical question, and I do not know the answer to this, but I would be very interested in seeing what's the empirical kind of answer to this, of whether, these effects that they document of the commodity price shocks are persistent even after prices go down, right? And this kind of connects to the model very nicely because, generically in this class of models, wages relatively go up in the short run, and then as labor supply adjusts, they go back down, although not all the way, in the long run. And it's very hard to generate persistent and gradual wage responses. And if, of course, these persistent dynamic responses appear on the data, right, and they are relevant, it would be interesting to see how the model can match this bust period, and if it is required to add capital, as in this recent stream of papers, to try to generate this persistence in the response of wages and employment. Finally, I want to make a point on the data, and as someone asked, informality in Brazil is sizable, and this is especially so in primary sectors, and there is a whole work of this by Gabriel Ulcea and his co-authors, right? And of course, in the census, as Felipe was saying, one can classify workers as formal or not, because there is this question that asks whether a worker has a formal contract which includes a social security card or not. So I went to the 2000 census, I classified workers across sectors. So I took the workers working in agriculture, fishing, and mining. I classified workers as if, as formal if they have the social security card, and as informal if not, right? This is of course a very rough calculation, but this rough calculation points towards 80% of the workers in this commodity sector as being informal, right? And of course, this is the usual limitation of these employer-employee data sets that, of course have, a wealth of information, but do not capture informality in middle-income economies. But I think that my main concern is that since this dynamic hat algebra essentially conditions on the initial observed allocation of workers across regions and sectors and on wages, the counterfactuals are going to be sensitive to the observed data, right? And there is, some recent work pointing towards the sensitivity, of our findings or our counterfactuals uh, when we have measurement error on the data. So I think it would be interesting to drill a little bit more into this issue, right? I mean, I think that there is this kind of clear way forward in which the authors use the census to create, to compute these allocations of workers and of wages, and they use the employee data sets to compute essentially the migration flows of these workers across, regions and sectors. But I think that this is a very important point to have in mind. Finally, I have a final small comment. It would be very interesting if the authors could expand a little bit the model to allow for the usual narratives related to resource scores and Dutch disease. And here, what I have in mind is essentially the narrow band paper by Krugman on this idea of dynamic comparative advantage. And the question would be whether favorable developments in commodity prices lead to permanent productivity losses of other sectors and regions and reduce aggregate welfare in the long run. And just as an example, in another context in Brazil, I have this paper with Paula Bustos, Martín Mestieri, Juanma, and Jacob Ponticelli, in which we find that industrialization induced by new technologies in agriculture can indeed reduce manufacturing TFP in the long run. Just to conclude, I think this is a great paper with a very precise research question and a convincing answer, and I'm really looking forward to reading the next version of this paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Felipe,
Okay.
would you?
So I'll take a wait, he disappeared. I'll take a couple of minutes. Now we have a set of great, really helpful comments. So thanks a lot for that. I'm gonna mention what I'm thinking out, some of them. So regarding the one comment was the persistence of the effects on the labor market, the persistence of the effects on wages. So that's something we have explored in the context of our previous paper, and the approach we had was one that was not explicitly mentioned there, but one thing that is a feature of the labor market in Brazil is wage rigidity. So it's not, in the end, it didn't end up in the final version of the other paper, but we're working separately on it, and maybe we can integrate it here. We were considering the effects of wage rigidity as a mechanism that generates persistence, right? Capital certainly could be another one. Yeah. So and exploring the past in general sounds like a great idea. The other thing I wanted to mention regarding informality, yes, we've been thinking out that it's a big issue, especially in the agricultural sector. One possible solution is that we had explored using data from the Brazilian household survey instead of the employer census. We gave it a try. In the end, the reason why we went with the census is because you have the migration flows, right? You can track workers over time, and so you can compute the migration flows and the other outcomes from the same source. But maybe it's not a bad idea to first document what you've documented, and second, maybe combine the data sources, which is something we were trying to do. In the end, we didn't do it, but we could go in that direction. Certainly, it would be useful. One thing is that I think rise. I mean, it's a little bit. It's always tricky how you measure informality. What you did in the demographic census is count the workers that have or don't have a signed card. In rise, it's a little bit different how the data is collected, because it's the firm that sort of dumps all the data on all the workers in the database. So, but still, it's a very sizable thing, right? The 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 last thing I was going to mention is that you had this kind of great suggestion of the validation of the model, essentially. How to calibrate it based on these regressions and then go back with the model generated data. So that's something we're going to definitely look at carefully and explore. But at first sight, it seems like a great idea. Yeah. So thanks a lot.
Let's open up the floor for questions. Sebastian?
It's a very interesting paper, Felipe. So I had a couple of comments, I guess. So the first comment is, if I understood correctly, in your production function, you have just labor. There's a question, I guess, with the commodities, whether other factors of production might benefit from the increase in the price, and in particular factors of production that cannot move over space. So I want, like land, right? Or maybe people who own the mines or something like that. And I wonder if that has implications for the regional inequality results. A related comment, I guess, is many times in this context, the government takes a slice of the boom, and they redistribute in ways that don't have to do with the geography necessarily. So I wonder if there's a way of capturing that in Brazil. The other thing is that you had these results that, if I understood you correctly, smaller regions tend to see bigger changes in employment. I think it would be interesting to understand whether that has to do with smaller regions are more open to migration, or they're more open to trade, or it just so happens that the composition of their production experience a larger price increase or something like that. But very interesting.
Felipe, just a quick question. So I think one of the things like for the labor supply elasticities, they already mention have some heterogeneity on a skill. But going back to the informality question, there is a lot of there are some results in Mayara's Felix paper that this elasticity labor supply is also depending on not the share of informality, because you cannot measure that, but the share of self-employment, which is sort of like a good proxy of informality. We find the same thing in Peru, so that might be another way to introduce, what is the effect of informality in your model, thinking about self-employment, which is something that you might be able to track.
Hi, Felipe, nice paper. So I wanted to ask you about labor force participation and if there is a home production sector in the model, because maybe low-skilled workers move more from not participating in the labor market to participating in the labor market. So I wanted to ask you if you have that home production sector in the model.
Okay. So thanks for all the questions. Sebastian was asking about other factors in the production function. So I just said it quickly, but I in the interest of time, I didn't show the equations for the production function, but we have an intermediate input coming from that combines all the sectors. So basically the consumption basket goes back into the production function. And in the commodity sector, there's also a natural resource that captures what you were saying, the land and the ownership of the mines. So that's there, but I apologize because it went real quick through the model and without that much detail. Yeah, the second point that you raised was that the profits from some commodities can go back to the government and be, let's say, later distributed in a way that's centralized and not region-specific. That's something we have thought in the past. I think that happens, I would say, mostly in the oil sector, which can be relevant, but it's a pretty small fraction of employment in Brazil. So the first point is that when you think out the sectors, the commodities that account for most employment, like coffee, sugar canes, soybeans, and then cattle, I would say there's little of that. But in addition, in our previous work, that was a paper, the paper that's now published had more reduced form results, and we do see a large response of regions to this commodity price index, which we would not see if everything goes, is distributed in a centralized way, like in the oil sector. But I think that concern is, probably mostly oil, but it's a small fraction of employment, but that's there, yeah. Then, we're gonna explore why smaller regions have this, larger employment responses. We can try to figure out if they're more open or what's going on. So that's a good idea. The next two questions can be sort of combined in a way. So I'm going to look at the paper you mentioned and Mayera Felix's paper and your paper to look at the self-employment aspect. And we do not have a home production sector, right? And we don't have an employment here or a home production sector. So that's something we're going to be thinking out, I guess. Yeah. So thanks a lot.
Actually, there's time for one last round of very quick questions. If anybody has any.
So this is related to Juanma's suggestion. I mean, another way you could maybe externally validate the results is do this, have this approach that Adao et al. Proposed, where see if the difference between the outcome, the predicted outcome, and the actual outcome is orthogonal to the price change, the commodity price change. In that case, you could basically validate and say whatever is left and the model cannot predict is basically orthogonal to this shock that I'm trying to explain.
Great. Any last questions or suggestions? Otherwise, we can move on to the next paper. Okay, so
thank you for thank you for that suggestion. I mean, we're gonna look into it.
Okay, great. Next up is Pamela Medina.
Thank you so much to the organizers for putting this paper on the program. It has been a great 2 days of conference and to see so many people, so many known faces. This is joint work with Sebastian, who is down there, and Daniel Velasquez, who is a student at the University of Michigan and is on the market this year. So as we have been really talking throughout this conference, the distributional effects of trade have received extensive attention. Felipe just had one of his papers. And we have, thank you. Sorry, I'm short. We have explored distributional effect of trade in terms of a lot of variables: employment, income inequality, health, even debt. But the organizing principle of all this literature has been that trade affects primarily labor demand. So what we want to propose in this paper is that a complementary view, trade directly affects labor supply. And why am I saying this? So we have noticed, I mean, this is our motivating sort of like fact, that since the 1990s, there has been a huge and a rapid growth of female labor force participation. And this is particularly driven by developing countries. At the same time, we have observed that there is a lot of adoption, again, in developing countries, of appliances that you might think that are time-saving household appliances. Your refrigerator, your washing machine, okay? And in developing countries specifically, this adoption has been or can be directly linked to trade, because these countries, most of them do not produce these appliances. Okay? So what we want to push in this paper or to examine is whether there is this labor supply mechanism of trade, and the intuition it's very simple. So we have openness to trade. There is an increase in appliance trade. There is a decrease in the price of appliances that people in developing countries can buy them from. Workers are going to be, this saves time in the household chores. Workers are going to be able to reallocate some of their time from home production to the labor market. And this is going to hinge more so in individuals that used to do most of the household chores that were, women. Okay? So that's very simple intuition. And what we want to do in this paper is basically to see whether this mechanism has some bite, if that is even present in the data, because these two things could be just like trends that are happening at the same time. And if that is the case, then to see how much of this labor force participation in the aggregate that we have seen over the last 30 years, we can track to this just diffusion of this technology. Okay, so that's the paper. How are we going to do this? So first, to see whether this mechanism has some bite, we have to go like very concrete, and we're going to look at Peru. We're going to develop this IBS strategy where we think about this exogenous decrease in the price of appliances. We're going to see whether this has an impact in the first stage of ownership of appliances in Peruvian households, and then whether, the second stage, it has a differentiated effect on female to male labor force participation. Okay. So the quick answer is yes. It's going to increase ownership of this exogenous decrease in import prices is going to increase ownership of appliances for males and for females around 35 percentage points. And we are going to have this late local average trimming effect in ownership to female labor force participation that is around 27 percentage points. So this is a huge effect, right? But this is, you have to take it, with a grain of salt, because we are talking about the compliers. We are talking about this is a late effect. Yeah.
Are you worried that appliances are a lumpy investment, and that if you have, let's say, relative constraints, then when somebody buys something, then everything becomes tighter, like you drew down your savings, and then the flexible part of the labor supply of the family tries to increase labor supply?
Well, we're sort of like going to be like very agnostic with this, with the first empirical evidence to show you, we want to show that this effect it's there. We are going to consider that when we go to the model, and we be more careful in these mechanisms. Okay. So again, this is just a late interpretation. You should think about this as a big effect, as a late interpretation. So we cannot really tell you what is the aggregate effect or how much this channel really accounts for the whole increasing labor force participation that we have seen in Peru over the last 30 years. Right? So to do that, we need to go to a model, and just also to do things like Ben said. I mean, there are many things that are happening, and there is so we need to go into a model. So we're going to build a dynamic general equilibrium model of trade and household production in a small open economy. We're going to have overlapping generations that are going to be buying durables, appliances, and this is the nature of you buy and you keep the durable for some time. And then they also have to do a choice of labor force participation. Okay. So the model is going to have a lot of bells and whistles that I'm going to explain a bit. But then we're going to calibrate the model to match what we see in the reduced form that I'm going to show you, and patterns in the Peruvian economy. And what we're going to basically simulate is the shock that we see in the data, a decrease in the prices of the relative prices of appliances of 75%. And what we're going to find is that, through all the model, there is an increase in female labor force participation of 3 percentage points. So is it big? It is a little bit more than 1/3 of the observed change in labor force participation of females in Peru. Okay, so we think that this is just a decrease in the price of appliances. We think this is as a channel, it is a sizable one. The effects are going to take long. The effects are going to take long to materialize. It's around 20 years because the generations have to basically move on, and there's going to be a lot of shocks in the middle. Costas. Exactly. That's actually going to be one of the moments where you're not used to me. Okay, so that's the paper. So we obviously going to touch to the literature that looks at international trade and what is the effect in domestic labor markets and trade, and then more recent and growing literature on trade and gender. But the contribution of this paper is to think about, sort of like complement the traditional trade affecting labor demand, thinking about trade also affect labor supply directly. And of course, in doing so, we're going to talk a lot to the literature in the household production and time location, specifically the paper by Greenwood and co-authors. Okay, so let me tell you a quick thing about the data and about the basic facts that motivate us, and then we go to the empirics. So we're going to use 3 sources of data. We're going to use the population censuses of Peru, 81, 93, 2007, and 2017. As you can see, Peru is not a very stable country, so it's not every 10 years, but it's what we have. They have ownership of appliance, access to water and electricity, demographic characteristics, and labor force participation. Okay. We're going to use the National Household Survey. We're going to use the panel dimension because we want to think about transitions between labor force participation and non-labor force participation. To match the model. And then we're going to look at customs data, that is basically the imports of appliances, we have unit values and so on. And then we're going to think about appliances, fixed ideas about refrigerators and washing machines that have very specific HS codes that we can track. Okay, what is the background? So this is sort of like going to repeat myself, but to fix ideas of what are the figures in Peru, right? So this is what you see on the left is labor force participation for female and male in Peru, and then you have on the right appliance ownership. Okay, so basically in both for female labor force participation and appliance ownership in terms of refrigerator and washing machine, they have increased over the last 30 years about 22 percentage points. Okay, yes. The short answer is no. We're going to take, what the literature says of Greenwood, basically about what he estimates for productivity increases. Yeah. What happened at the same time that we see these trends, what happened in Peru with import prices, basically, so just to fix ideas, Peru does not produce these appliances. So what you should see on the customs data is basically the supply of these things to the Peruvian economy. It's like Peruvian, the percentage of manufacturing of household appliances in GDP, it's 0.015, it's like nothing. And it's mostly parts. So you have import unit values of these appliances and import quantities. So what can you see is basically import prices have plummeted, a huge increase in quantities of 10 times. Okay. So what I want you to think about this is a good proxy for what the consumer prices, consumer face in terms of prices, as well as when a shock to exogenous shock to supply of these appliances. Okay, so now the stylized facts. So this is our data. So I'm gonna show you 3 stylized facts. So the first one is that ownership of appliances does increase female labor force participation. We're going to find some heterogeneity. These effects are stronger in married women, and these are going to be stronger for younger generation as well as young people. Okay, so ownership and female labor force participation. Obviously, ownership and female labor force participation, we need an instrument, and we're going to use, these import prices to instrument for ownership. Okay. The second stage is basically these regressions are done at the individual I living in a district D. District is the most like disaggregated geopolitical zone in Peru of sex G at time T of the censuses. Okay, so that is we're gonna regress it of whether you own or not the appliance. A lot of controls at the individual level, trends in terms of labor for participation, college education, and so on. And also, because trade also affects labor demand at the same time that, when you open to trade, we're going to have some controls as similar to, the Bartik shocks that we usually use to try to tackle labor demand effects as that trade control that you see there. We're going to instrument ownership with this changing in the price of, this exogenous change in the price of appliances. So obviously what we will want is basically that households that are in different parts of Peru face different prices, and we will love to observe the prices that they actually pay. We do not. We only see input prices that are at the national level. So what we need to do is basically create some heterogeneity at the regional level, at this district level, of how much of these decreasing prices affected you, okay? So what we do is basically create a weighted average of these decreasing prices for refrigerators and washing machine, multiply by the share at the baseline share at that district level, a very fine geographical unit, of how many households in that district had electricity or had water in their dwelling. Thinking about it, both electricity and water are sort of like necessary conditions to be able to get a refrigerator or a washing machine. Okay? So that's our price index. We have played around with, thinking about only one appliance, taking the chairs and so on. The patterns are going to remain constant. Yes, Ben? Exactly. This one. This one. That's the prices for both.
It would be nice if it was not a secular trend, right? Like you're basically picking developed and less developed regions in 1993, and it would be nice if you had like temporal variation of like those prices. It really looks like a
Yeah, I mean this is the problem of like we could have like a little bit more like lumpiness on these prices if we use, for instance, the now like the household surveys that are annual. This is census. We have only like basically 3 points. So even if they are lumpy, you're gonna keep 3 points that are like decreasing. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. We are thinking about that. We haven't yet tried that because we wanted like some instrument also to like electrification. We just found that one, but it's on the to-do list. Yeah, but yeah. Okay. So let me show you what we find, and what you find is basically the first 3 columns are the second stage with adding the controls, and the 4th column is the first stage, basically prices and ownership. So let's go through in reverse. First, looking at the appliances or decreasing import prices and ownership, and this is for females, but the same first stage is exactly the same for men. So you see that basically the decreasing real prices does incentivize ownership of appliance at the household level. So what happened now with this ownership for the compliers? And this is the tricky thing. For the compliers, for the ones that adopted bought their appliance, well, for females, that increases labor force participation in 27 percentage points. So that's the 3rd column. Okay. If you look at the same, I don't have the same graph for men, but if you look at the same graph for men, basically the effect is half as large. Okay. And then it doesn't matter whether you try different controls, different price index, this pattern, it's pretty robust. Okay. Yes?
So most of the variation probably at some level is in that big price drop rather than the wage component of the real price index. One concern would be why this is so big is there's going to be households that have like a big wage shock, like they find a good job then it may pay off, and you can pay off then go buy a machine and actually pick up that job.
Yeah.
Right. So separating supply and demand, if you have a real price index with P and W, is pretty hard.
So here, what we do in the specification to try to control for changes in wages induced for trade is that that's why we control for these trade variables. Any other changes in wages that are happening at the same time as our prices, we cannot do that. So that's, I think, another reason why when we go to the model, we want to think about that too. Yeah. Oh, so we use the 1981 census to create trends of labor force participation for females and males between. So we don't use that in the regression. We start from 1993 onwards to have pre-trends.
So the WGD is the labor force participation.
No. That's W is a set of variables.
Okay, so I guess I want to know what's that.
Oh, so we have labor force participation at for females and for males at the district level in 1981 interacted by this trend. So then we started to look, okay, if where does this effect come from? What is the heterogeneity? So what I'm showing you here is for females again, for single and married females, and then what you see basically this effect is coming from married females. For single one, it's not that important, and for men, it's not true. It's actually the reverse. The effect is only interesting for single. For married, nothing happens. We check also for family size, right? So here in the census, we wanted to have whether you have kids or not. In the census, we cannot know whether you have kids. We only know how many people live in the house and the age. So we have tried with whether there are kids in the house or not. It's very noisy. So that's why we don't include the level of heterogeneity. And then another level of heterogeneity is for who this is more important, and we do a cohort study. Basically, we have a different specification here. We have cohort C and province, because we needed a little bit more aggregation to do this. Province, which is the second, how much time do I have? Okay. Second geopolitical division of Peru. So what we have here is basically we have the same intuition that in order to be able to be shocked, let's say, or have more intensity of the shock, you need to have some electrification or some water. So we divide this axis beam, which is basically beams from 0 to 33, 33 to 66, and so on. Computed with the access measure. So think about the beam 3 is you have a lot of utilities. Beam 0, you don't have much utility. The time of cohorts, we have 8 cohorts by the year of birth, and those are the ones. We have provinces effects, and we have a share of controls. Okay. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna fix only to see the effect of people that are between 30 to 45 years old, just to fix ideas. And let's see who are the cohorts that are controlled and the cohorts that are treated. So here, the shock is not that clear, right? Because we don't have, these decreasing prices affecting this particular cohort. So what we're gonna say is that at 1993, prices were high. And then the prices start decreasing after 1993 because Peru did a unilateral trade liberalization, then you have the China shock, and so on. Okay? So for the census of 2007 and the census of 2017, the people that were 30 to 45, then they were treated. Okay, so this is sort of like much less finer, let's say, regression than what we did before. So you have the control cohorts, and then you have the treated cohorts involved there. We're going to have this guy as a remitter category, and these two all cohorts are to look at pre-trends. Okay, so what you see here, and this is only for like, medium access to electricity, high access to electricity, what is the effect of the treatment, which is just, you were faced with some shock of prices, if you have a lot of electricity or not, in terms of ownership. So what you can see is basically relative to the people that did not have electricity, this shock increases the ownership, the probability of ownership appliances, and this is more so for younger cohorts. Okay? Why is it important that it's more so for younger cohorts? Younger cohorts, like imagine today, you are born today, or you're 30 today, you already see prices of appliances very, very low. So basically, you have taken all of the shock, right? If you were just like 30 in 2001, let's say, when the shock hits, then you see a little bit of the decrease in prices. Okay, so that's the intuition. What happened with female labor force participation? Well, female labor force participation, again, look at the ones that have electricity and
the live stream.
yeah. Okay. So for I'm going to just stay with this one. So for the ones that have electricity, well, you see an increase also in labor force participation, and again, this is more so for the cohorts that are younger. This is all the figures that I've shown you is for people that are 30 to 45. So this is telling you that younger cohorts are most affected. But also you can do the same thing as, for people 50, 65, or like 20, 30. So what you see is that if you do this for people 50, 65, then the effects are way more muted. So it's not only that the effects are larger for younger cohorts, but also that the effects are larger for younger people. Okay. Okay, so those are the three points of empirical evidence. Still, we haven't answered. I hope that this convinces you that this mechanism has some bite. That apparently there is some response of labor force participation to this exogenous change in prices of appliances. We haven't answered the question of like how much if this effect is high or no, because we only have these late coefficients. So for that we need a model. So we're going to complicate a little bit the intuition. So I'm just going to give you, a brief summary of the model. We're going to have a collection of small open economies. We should think about, we are thinking Peru, this is a small open economy. Why is good? Because they are going to take the prices of appliances as given, as we are assuming also in our empirical part, okay? We're going to have overlapping generations, so each generation lives a J period, so at every point in time we have J generations alive. We are going to have some states of the household, right? So households are going to have some state J, which is the age. They are going to own or not own appliances. Okay, forget about this intermediate state. Then we're going to have L, which is basically whether you are on the labor market or not, and then whether you have electricity in the household or not. Okay, so these are the working. Okay, so we're only going to think about the decision of working or not working of the female in that house. Okay, so each of the members of the household are going to have a labor supply of 1. For men, it's going to be basically predetermined, because we're going to assume that the man will give some of his time to the house and give some of his time to the market. The woman is going to decide whether to go to work or not. Married men, the counterpart, it's not it's not responding. You're right. You're right. In that sense, yeah, that's a good point. Point taken. Yeah. Okay. So what are the preferences? So basically, household have preferences between market goods M or household goods G, okay, with some elasticity of substitution eta. That's going to be important in a bit. Market goods can be sourced from all countries, and this is going to come with some elasticity of substitution theta. The income of the household is going to be, here there's no heterogeneity on the income for the men, but it will depend whether you have the part of the income of the woman, if she works or not. There's going to be some technology of household production, right, to create my household goods. I'm going to put some work on that, but there is going to be a productivity term B, okay? And this productivity term B is going to be also another key parameter of the model. We're going to have the technology for market good production. So this is market good production. Basically, it's going to aggregate, the time in the market for that men provides as well as the female provides with some elasticity sigma, and that's also another key parameter of the model. Okay. So in the static part, one thing that I didn't mention is that we have only an extensive margin of women. Women decide to go to the labor market and then have some hours. I am of age J, I own an appliance, I am working, I have electricity. Well, they have some utility flow of that state, but I can also go with probability phi to a state where I don't have appliance. So the initial flow, it's going to be super important. Right now, you see there is a subscript T, and this is also going to, I want to get your thoughts on that in a bit. So we have labor. Basically, labor is just aggregating all the labor that men and women provide, and then increases, so that increases ownership. So that's sort of like in the model. But what happened with labor force participation? And I think here there is like sort of like a beauty of like having a model that it's not clear necessarily that that is gonna increase labor force participation of females. So why is that? Because so if you increase the productivity of the household good, now that you have appliances, that productivity in the production function of like appliances goes up, right? So that might reduce the cost of the household goods, and then you get higher consumption. But so that's the B, that's the productivity. That's going to change. But that also the ADA there, which is the elasticity of substitution between markets and market good and household good, is going to play a huge role. So it's not clear because we're going to be calibrating this elasticity if these goods are very substitute. It's not clear the labor for participation is going to go up. Okay, so that's going to be an empirical question. Then we're going to have this eta bar, right? Sorry, M bar, which is the initial flow of people to different states, and that can vary by time, right? So imagine that if you over time you have more electrification, so more people decide to buy appliances that is not related, to the decrease in prices. Okay, so that eta bar is going to change over time. Right now we are putting exogenous, but decrease labor participation as a general equilibrium effect. Okay, so there are different models, parts in the model that it's not obvious that labor for participation has to increase once you have decrease in the prices of appliances, and we think that this is super rich in the sense that we're trying to see what the data says. Okay, so what do? We calibrate this to the Peruvian data. We're going to focus today only on households 25, 50-year-old. We have only 5 group of households, cohorts, and we have 5-year period. We are going to take 1990 as our steady state, the period between 1990 and 1995. We have some parameters that are going to be basically calibrated externally. That is just taken from the literature. We're going to match some moments that we take from the data, and then we'll do some indirect inference. So what do we take from the literature? I think that's the question of Manuel, that basically one of the key parameters that we take from the literature is this labor productivity in appliances, what Greenwood have used prior, because we really don't have this, a good estimate of how much time saving a washing machine gives you. Your labor productivity increases 26. 26%. Yeah. And this is this is the best estimation that people have come up with for this. So this is a calibration of the second and third type of parameters. So we fit a lot of the things to things on the household survey, population census, and so on. And then we have these parameters that basically we do in indirect inference. So this ADA here, which I told you that it was super important, this ADA here, which is the elasticity, the substitution between non-market and market goods. So we are leaving it to what are these substitute, or there is some complementarity there. These shape parameters of the shocks, we estimate that. And also, this ADA bar, which is something that it's worrying us. So this ADA bar, how do we endogenize it? And the best way that we have come up so far to endogenizing is basically we're having two parameters that tells us how it is skewed over time, and we are match some of the moments to make this in the data, in the model. So what you see in the data is the red crosses, and then the blue dots are what we have in our model. So we're not like completely there yet, but the model does a very good job in to think about, especially like that the youngest cohorts are the ones that get most affected by the shock. Okay, so we're still matching. I don't remember who asked the questions. We're still matching these very high late coefficients, but you will see when we do through the model and through the aggregation, this is not this rationalized a more like nuance effect. Okay, so now we're aggregating my last 3 minutes that I have. We aggregate this and we see, okay, once we have the shock, a decrease in 75% of the price of appliances, what are the dynamics? So we see an increase in around 20% of the ownership of appliances. These effects, of course, take long to materialize, not only because we have a lot of shocks through the transition, but also because generations are like leaving. This accounts for 44% of the adoption of appliances that we see in the data. Okay, so this is not surprising because Peru doesn't produce these appliances, so adoption has to be really tightly linked to the imports of these appliances. In labor for participation, what we have is this is around like 4%. What you see here, one thing that I did mention is that we're thinking about households that have electricity. So 60% of the households in Peru have electricity, so you should multiply it by 60%. So it's around 2.7 percentage points increase of this shock, okay? And this is around 12% of the observed 22 percentage point that we see over this period, okay? Again, a little bit like, it takes around 20 years to materialize the shock. What happened with wage gap? And this is just because, when you have more female in the labor force, that decreases the wages of women. So that's sort of like the only mechanism that changes this wage gap. But basically, the wage gap between wages of females and male increases.
So this is just one-time shock in the price?
Yes, and permanent. Yeah, exactly. And then why these effects take long to materialize is just to give you, it's a compositional change of like this generation. Some generations are going to be like, we need to replace generations, and you see that for ages that are old, how this replacement takes place. That's why it creates the 20 years to consolidate. So I don't know have much time, but let me tell you, so where are we with the paper? So the next step is like two types of steps in terms of empirics. We're concerned about these electricity shares because electricity, it's also changing over the same time that we're seeing the prices of appliances going down. So we have now this program that I used in previous work with this rural electrification that sort of like exogenously we could think about, we know whether the places that were exogenously change this share of electrification. We can use that. We have told you, prices are going to be decreasing over this period of time because so many things happen. So we can try to think about, be more specific about what are the trade shocks that happen through this period. That's another thing that we're exploring. On the calibration, this M bar, it's really key, right? So what basically that's going to tell you, over time, the flow of people that enter into each state needs to be changing. How it needs to be changing, we need to think about hard a little bit how to endogenize this M bar. We don't have consumption saving problems, so that doesn't help really when to fit that, the old people doesn't want to buy appliances, so we need to think about that. And right now we have only households that have electricity, so we need to incorporate these beans of electricity access. So that's everything what we have. So just to wrap up this paper, it's thinking about, complementary to the literature that looks at trade labor market, but think about a direct mechanism that affect trade and labor supply. And basically what we have is that, there is a diffusion of technology that save time in the household chores, so that should free up some time for females especially to go to the labor market. When we go to the model, it's actually not clear that this is going to be the case. It's an empirical question, yeah, I'll leave it like that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Tatjana Kleinenberg is our discussant.
The full screen is. Yeah, it didn't work. Control F. Edit. Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you so much for having me as a discussant here on this very interesting paper. So most of the literature looks at how trade affects labor demand. So here it takes basically this different approach and saying, well, if we're trading specific machinery or specifically household appliances, it also affects the productivity of doing chores at home and the labor supply by freeing up domestic labor. And the effects from this are very heterogeneous. Of course, women are affected much more, and then as Pamela has shown, they also find young and married to be more affected. So the paper is very nice in gathering a lot of data of actually and an empirical strategy to actually identify these causal effects. And they use these price declines that is driven by the importing countries and interact that with districts' access to electricity, and then they find these very large effects in the late. But they don't stop here. They also go to a very rich quantitative general equilibrium model in which they can then assess the aggregate effects. And the key contributions of the model is as well that it allows for actually counting for a lot of general equilibrium interactions, both in the consumption basket, so home and market goods are substitutes, and if you produce more or less of the one, that will have an effect also on the labor demand. But then also there's general equilibrium in wages, and here importantly, like men and women are considered to be imperfect substitutes. So when more women start entering the labor more about the characteristics of which type of women or households are most affected by the price shock. And then I'm going to talk about why I think these potential heterogeneity in who responds to the price shock might be important for these key contributions of the model, especially the transition dynamics, and also how actually wages will respond in general equilibrium. So the data, it's a bit of an annoying point, but based on the census data. But then certain variables like the wage is not available in the census, and I think that the authors take this from the household survey. And unfortunately for labor force participation for women, nobody I talked to knew why there are these differences of how the census is counting it versus the survey. But this is basically the paper based on the census data from the figure from the paper. You see that labor force participation, which increases here for women a lot, is pretty low in the beginning of the period, below 40%, and increases much steeper. But if you look at the same variables in the survey, the level is much higher, much higher. It's like 66% here in almost the same year. It's a little bit less coverage. And it also, the increase is much steeper. So I think, I mean, nobody really, like, I don't know which one is more right, but I think maybe an appendix section where you just say, because you have all variables in sort of that you need in 1993. But then the second stage looks at, well, like the labor force participation. And I just wonder if you use the survey data, actually, you could also exclude potential migrants. So if people who are more likely, if they have a very high incentive of going in the labor force, they might be more likely to migrate towards districts that offer utilities, that offer water and electricity once appliances become cheaply available. So there might be some selection in who moves there and who then goes into the labor market. And I think the panel dimension of the survey would allow you to just exclude those, but probably the migration channel would not. I wouldn't expect it to change your results massively either. And then the second thing, so in your empirical part, of course, like in the identification, you do control for all individual characteristics, but the heterogeneity you choose to kind of spell out in more detail is only whether the woman is married and then the age. And I was actually really curious also about the characteristics in terms of, well, education or also income, but education specifically, because I think it matters a lot then for the general equilibrium and for the labor market and the production side. And here it goes back to kind of this question, like I think that Ben raised. Appliances is a lumpy investment. So who buys it, or how sensitive a household is to relative prices and price decreases, or who even can afford the appliance at all, will depend on the income. And one proxy of this is probably how educated both the husband and the wife are. So it would be interesting to just know this lumpy investment, this appliance price, in terms of like, how does it compare to different points of the income distribution? Is this something like a whole year of earnings for people below, I don't know which percentile, or kind of like which, how likely are different people to be even able to afford this appliance? And here, of course, also, if financial constraints matter, it would affect your transition dynamic, which is one of the nice outcomes that you can show in your model. And there would be heterogeneity maybe in who buys appliances, who responds, and who enters the labor market. And if the more educated and richer households are more likely to buy it, and then those women are more likely to enter the labor force, you would have very different potentially wage effects, which are now abstracted in the model. So with this, I actually already come to my points on the model. So here the transition dynamic, as I said, it depends for you only on the age effects. So if you make a lumpy investment, it's durable. If you're young, that is more valuable for you. If you only have 5 years left to retirement, why would you buy it? You have very few gains left from trying to enter the labor force. But then also young people are more likely to be higher educated compared to the average of the labor force, because we see like a back expansion in education in that period. And you would likely have very different people entering at different points of the transition period, I think. And yeah, that's basically related also to, again, this willingness to pay for the appliances and limited ability to borrow. And with that, the heterogeneity of people who enter, they do matter for your general equilibrium effects in the wages. So in the model right now, the only heterogeneity for workers is men or women. And you model them as imperfect substitutes in production, which is in some sense, which then leads to the effect that if women enter and men are kind of the same all around, then the wages of women will go down, and the gender wage gap will almost by definition, like the sign you could already know from the theory without estimating the model. But these imperfect substitutes, which is here just a CS function, is in some sort of reduced form for capturing something micro-founded that's different about the men and women who are in the labor force. So specifically, that would kind of pick up, like, do they differ maybe in brawn? Do they differ in skills, so specifically in education? Or do they differ in the tasks that they do in the market? Like maybe they do very different occupations, different industries, or have a comparative advantage in that. But this parameter is actually not really something that's completely policy invariant because of the points that I mentioned. If now more skilled women, for example, can afford the appliance and enter the labor market, and then they become more similar to men because men always have been more skilled and they're more likely to do the same tasks as men, then they would become more substitutable to men because they become more similar. But reversely, you can also imagine kind of the G effect through the consumption. If now certain home-based, low-skilled services are outsourced to the market, like think about childcare, now women are not doing it anymore at home, so more people have to do it in the market, and maybe that tends to be an occupation that all women do, then maybe they would become actually more different to men, and actually the substitutability would go down. I mean, all of these heterogeneity margins are very hard to incorporate in the very rich model, but I think if in your data you find that especially kind of this high or low skill or education margin is very important in responding to this shock. I think just expanding from having two worker types, like men and women, to also having high skilled, low skilled, seems like an exogenous type of state, not something that I would suggest doing like endogenizing or anything right now, but it seems like that could be tractable, and then you could actually spell out the general equilibrium effects of the wages and the responses, I think in a nicer way, and just be a bit like more richer on how the gender wage gap would change in general, or conditional on education of men and women. So that heterogeneity might be worth exploring in the data and the model. I just looked at the survey data. Of course, I didn't run the your causal regressions, but here it actually looks at just in the survey here. I don't know how it looks in the census, but the female low-skilled actually increased their labor force participation much more in that period than the high-skilled. And I think I said like completed secondary was high-skilled in this in this graph. And again, it's unclear how that would respond to your shock, because richer people probably adopt very early once the appliance becomes available. Poorer countries, poorer households might not be able to afford it at all, depending on the constraints. And then again, like there might also be income effects on how much valuable it is for them to enter the labor market. But wrapping up, I think it's a very nice paper on a very important topic, looking at a new angle of appliance trade on labor supply. I think you can use these rich microdata even more to trace out another margin of heterogeneity in addition to age and marriage status, to also look at education. And if you find that it matters, I would encourage you to try to make the rich dynamic model even more richer by potentially augmenting the types not only by gender but by high skilled and low skilled, and then kind of tracing out how that heterogeneity matters over the
Thank you so much, Tatiana. It's really great, because I think we have been sort of like talking about, as I mentioned, extensions of the model, but I think you basically concretize what we need to do and give us like a to-do list, so it's always great. For the life of me, I don't know what happened with the census and now. Like we have tried, like seriously, this is like the problem when you work with data from developing countries. We don't know. Like the answer is we don't know. We noticed this. Like and now it's not a tiny difference. It's like 20% difference. That one says that 20% more women in Peru are labor force versus not. What I really like, which we thought, okay, we have to like take a stand on one. We did the census because we thought that and now it's not representative at the district level, which is the unit that we wanted to do. But I really like that you highlighted that the slope is different. So I think this is a reason enough for us to do like a little bit more robustness test on thinking about how does it look, the results with the now. About the heterogeneity, yes, I think I really like the two sides. So I think for sure we need to think about skills. We have been talking about this, maybe not that going to have like a lot of abilities, but a high and low could be feasible. We have not explored this. We need to check whether this heterogeneity exists first on, in what sense it exists on the data. And the other thing that I also really like about how do we can, make this paper broader in terms of heterogeneity is the financial frictions, and that I think it's something that we can also add once we add this saving consumptions part. And finally, I think we always thought about this paper about like an accounting paper of how much the channel account for the aggregate. But I do think now that we, as you said, like we have the model. It's what about the policy of electrification? This is this is gonna be something that we could look, or a policy of electrification. Yeah, thank you so much.
Great. Questions from the floor. Paulo.
Yeah, very interesting. So I had a question about the reduced form. So did you have a chance to compare the evolution of prices of appliances with other capital goods that could affect an industrialization and labor demand, especially in these areas that are more electrified? Kind of, I was worried that if you could really disentangle these channels.
I wanted to ask two quick questions. It's a great paper. The first one is, I'm Chilean. I'm gonna just think out what I know about Chile and just assume that it applies to Peru. And you might tell me that it's wrong, but so I would assume that in the initial periods there's a lot of people without housing, or with very minimal housing, or houses that don't have space for any appliances or anything. And I'm also gonna guess that over the next decades, the government played a big role in developing houses, giving houses to people that didn't own the house, didn't own the land, lived in like places that just kind of landed on. And so whether having a house that actually has a kitchen, or a bathroom, might play a role. The other question is whether I should think out cars as a household appliance in a way. I know we don't call it a household appliance, but it's kind of like a washing machine with wheels, and it also helps me participate in the labor force.
Okay, great. Let's take some time to respond, and then we'll collect some more.
Okay, for Monica, thank you so much. I think, I think for sure, I think this all the questions about heterogeneity, it just basically says we need to introduce heterogeneity. I'm putting Sebastian on the line, like we are putting heterogeneity on this. The losing jobs, I think we can actually, it will be hard to incorporate in the model, but we can look at it empirically, because there is a categorization to be worker in the household, so we could see whether that also changes with this pricing person. So the need in those districts of this type of workers.
I think the only concern is that it's not extensive margin.
Yeah.
You still hire someone,
but less hours.
Things that he has to do,
cooking.
It's more like, reduction and it's intensive.
Yeah, that's right. Paulo, yes, we look at other capital goods. So we look at basically just in the terms of trend. What happens if you own, instead of ownership appliances, you own a TV? And this goes to Felipe's question, go on a car, I think we have a computer. We have computer, but only in the later censuses, computer, TV, and car. And I have to, basically, we did not find like these effects, and definitely not different effects between female and male. So we did that with the ones that the census allows us. Actually, we go to the now, we can be a little bit more careful because they do have a battery of like things that you purchase in the last. So yeah, I think that's that.
One final round of comments, questions.
Yeah, I have two comments, questions. So one is a bit more like big picture. I'm thinking about the census. I was wondering how different labor markets are. So in this literature, there's a literature in macro that relate structural change with the female labor force participation and gender wage gap. For example, paper by Rachel Ngai and Petroglon. That in those paper they have productivity shock in market sector and home production sectors. So in your case in Peru, I feel like when Peru opened to trade, there's a lower price appliance with we can think of as a productivity shock in the home sector, but also it might be productivity shock in the manufacturing or formal sector as well. And so this is intriguing to me because one of your prediction of the model, your model is that this low price appliance increase the gender wage gap, and in the sort of that other literature, they basically say that there's a bigger productivity shock in manufacturing and so on. So both male and female worker reallocate to this trade sector, and then that also increase female labor force participation, but the gender wage gap actually close. So I wonder if you have any comments on what how we, because it's also might relate to the point about instrument, because it could be trade openness, reduce price could correlate with some shock in the income, and that can affect the participation. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so for Adra's question, we did actually this regression at the beginning. We thought that this was going to be like for a cross-country paper. So we did that for Brazil and for Chile, the same regression that I showed you with those census, and we find the same effects. So in terms of like the effects, it seems to be like that's sort of like a more broad take. That even though the trends in labor force participation in Brazil, they look very close to Peru in the sense that they are going up, but in Chile no. Like actually the labor force participation of female in Chile, like the steep, it's pretty low. And the last comment about the structural transformation. So here, really, just to be very direct and transparent, as Tatiana was saying, men work all the time, right? So then when you have, when women just go, for any reason, go to the labor force participation, what it does is basically, given the substitution between men and women, they decrease wages for women. And that's where the increase in the wage gap is coming from. So it's a very mechanical effect, which might not be super, neat. It might help, the heterogeneity that everybody is suggesting in order to sort of like not have this just mechanical effect and be a little bit more, have that this more interesting. But yeah, that's it is on the model. It's mechanical in that sense.
Okay, thank you. I think that concludes the session. Thanks for 2 excellent papers. We reconvene at noon for the keynote.